The 8th Battalion of the Bedfordshire Regiment was designated a service battalion, meaning that it was raised specifically for the duration of the war. When the British Empire joined the Great War in August 1914, the British Secretary of State for War, Lord Herbert Kitchener, quickly realised that the war was likely to be long, and that the existing British army was not nearly large enough to fight a land war against the significantly larger Central Powers. In response, he started the process of raising a sequence of new armies from mid-August 1914, which are often referred to as Kitchener's Army or even Kitchener's Mob. The response to Kitchener's famous call to arms around Bedfordshire was both instant and enormous. The 8th Battalion was formed at Bedford in September 1914 as a part of the 3rd New Army, dubbed K3, with Lieutenant Colonel Herbert Martin being the battalion's first commanding officer from its formation, until Lieutenant Colonel Edward Stanley Kerwin Kennedy assumed command from the 1st of October 1914. The surplus recruits from the original rush of men enlisting early in September, along with the continuing steady stream of incoming recruits, saw the battalion being brought up to full strength soon afterwards, although experienced officers and NCOs were sparse in the early months. That month, the battalion was assembled and posted to the 71st Infantry Brigade of the 24th Infantry Division, where it remained for a little over a year. During its time in the 71st Infantry Brigade, the Bedfordshires served alongside the following battalions: the 8th Battalion of the Bedfordshire Regiment, the 9th Battalion of the Norfolk Regiment, the 9th Battalion of the Suffolk Regiment, and the 11th Battalion of the Essex Regiment. The division initially trained in and around Brighton, with its early life being difficult. Other than a sparsity of officers and NCOs to start their training, there were no organised billeting arrangements with the men sleeping under canvas as winter approached. No uniforms were issued until March 1915, and no rifles were issued until July 1915, just weeks before they were deployed overseas. Late in June 1915, the division was moved to Surrey, with the Bedfordshires training around Woking and Chobham. After just a matter of weeks working with their new rifles, and with specialised training for machine gunners and the like still at an early stage, the men of the Hungry 8th, which was a nickname used in the letter home from Private 19861 Leslie Warboys, received orders to mobilise, and they prepared to ship out. At 11 p.m. on the 28th of August 1915, the battalion boarded the troop trains at Chobham Station and left for Dover. After transferring straight onto troop ships, they arrived at Boulogne-sur-Mer early on the 30th of August 1915. While the bulk of the new army units would spend their first year getting used to life in the front lines before the Battle of the Somme 1916 introduced them to their first set-piece battle and the harsh realities of industrial warfare, the 8th Bedfordshires had an unusually difficult first year. They also managed to get through an impressive number of commanding officers. After a few days hurriedly concentrating around Etaples, 2 completely untried new army divisions, the 21st and the 24th, were moved east by a series of long forced marches with no instructions, insufficient rest and very little food, before being fed into the Battle of Loos, which, perhaps ironically, is actually pronounced Loss. GHQ kept the 2 new army divisions too far behind the fighting line to be of any use in the first day, and once they started being fed into the fighting, things went from bad to worse. The 9th Suffolks and 11th Essex led the brigade's assault on the 26th of September, with the 9th Norfolks initially in support and the Bedfordshires being held as brigade reserve. But when a new verbal order arrived, the Norfolks were diverted to assault a quarry, with the Bedfordshires sent to support them 4 hours later. But amidst the general chaos, with poor visibility courtesy of smoke, thick mist and clouds of gas swirling around the open, featureless ground, the lead company soon lost direction. None of the British troops they encountered knew anything, and the battalion were ordered back to the British lines, having failed to support the assault on a fortified quarry, which would cost the isolated Norfolks over 200 casualties. In the after-battle reports, a very long list of criticisms were aimed at all levels of leadership and organisation, from GHQ down. Referring to the 73rd Brigade, they recorded that the Brigadier would appear to have been unequal to the situation, as he was superseded during the fighting. The new Brigadier reports that the troops behaved well and steadily. The 71st Infantry Brigade had 2 battalions diverted, of which one, 9th Norfolk Regiment, attacked a portion of the quarries, but failed with the loss of 202 officers and men. The other, 8th Bedfordshire Regiment, appears to have been badly led, and failing to find the battalion, they were ordered to support, never became seriously engaged. The Bedfordshire's Lieutenant Colonel, Edward Kennedy, was among the battalion's very few casualties that day, and was immediately sent back to the UK suffering from the effects of gas, so whether the criticism was aimed at him or not is unclear. But the 24th Division lost almost 4,200 men during the fighting for very limited gains. After the battle, the division moved north to the Ypres salient, and the army reorganised, which included the 71st Brigade moving into the 6th Regular Infantry Division on the 11th of October. Captain, Temporary Lieutenant Colonel John Sinclair Liddell also assumed command from that day until the 13th of January 1916, at which time he was transferred to another battalion. The 17th of November 1915 saw a further reorganisation within the 6th Division, with the Bedfordshires moving into the 16th Brigade of that division, where they would remain for the rest of their existence. The 16th Infantry Brigade was comprised the 1st Battalion of the Buffs, being the East Kent Regiment, the 1st Battalion of the King's Shropshire Light Infantry, the 2nd Battalion of the York and Lancaster Regiment, and the 8th Battalion of the Bedfordshire Regiment. The battalion were also in the front lines when the German army first used Phosgene gas, just days before Christmas 1915. A combination of their gas helmets not being designed for this new gas, and there being no colour to warn the defenders it was approaching, increased casualties. Coupled with intense shelling that did not stop until the early hours of the 21st of December, the brigade's entire front line had a difficult time, and by the end of the shelling, the 16th Brigade had lost over 300 men, with Brigadier Nicholson's personal diary recording that the 8th Bedfords had the worst of this, and I sent Tower, being his brigade major, up to their line after dark. He came back about 8 p.m. and reported them badly shaken, so I sent one company of the Y&L, being the 2nd York and Lancaster, up to relieve their men in the front trenches. Relief was carried out without much difficulty. Working parties were also out, but did little work on account of the shelling. Reports came in during the day from which it was gathered that the gas was turned on about 5:15 a.m. under cover of slow rifle fire and followed in about a quarter of an hour by heavy rifle fire. On the right sector, the Bedfords opened steady and well-controlled rifle fire, and supporting artillery put a barrage on the German front trenches. Major, Temporary Lieutenant Colonel Henry Cholmondeley Jackson took command between the 14th of January 1916 and the 17th of April, when he was shot in the leg whilst checking the battalion lines east of Ypres. From his spelling command of the battalion, once he'd recovered, he went on to command a brigade, then a division, finally becoming a full general, and eventually the colonel of the regiment between 1935 and 1948. On the 19th of April 1916, German shelling of the division's front lines intensified, becoming a heavy bombardment by mid-afternoon, which was followed up with an infantry assault. Brigade Major Towns was temporarily commanding the Bedfordshires at the time, and reported at 8:30 p.m. that D-20 was in German hands, the garrison having been destroyed to a man. Within an hour, patrols verified that D-21, Willow Walk and S-12A were also lost. At 2 a.m. on the 20th, one company of Bedfordshires and one company of the York and Lancasters counterattacked. Although the Bedfordshires reported they had captured their objective, the officer commanding was unfamiliar with the area and mistook the objective, which was in reality still in German hands. By the end of the fighting, the 16th Brigade had lost 23 officers and 520 other ranks, with the 8th Bedfordshires losing 8 of those officers and 213 men. The brigade's war diary reported that the conduct of the 8th Bedfordshire Regiment up to the time of their withdrawal from the line, on the night of the 20th-21st, was very steady. Practically the whole of the garrison of the front line, except the prisoners claimed by the enemy, are either killed or wounded. The remaining companies were heavily shelled at the same time and suffered considerable losses. In spite, however, of their heavy losses, they were fit to put back into the line on the nights 22nd to 23rd and 23rd to 24th. Over the next 6 weeks, the battalion went through several more commanding officers in very short succession. Major, Temporary Lieutenant Colonel William Rowland Harris Dan took command for a few weeks from late April, until he was also wounded on the 19th of May 1916. Then Captain, Temporary Lieutenant Colonel Donald MacLeod Hawkins held the command between the 19th of May and the 1st of June, until Colonel Lord Henry Scott arrived on the 2nd of June 1916, and would lead the battalion until the 4th of April 1917, when he was promoted to a senior post at GHQ. Despite being only 10 months long, his command would prove to be the longest the battalion experienced on the front lines. The 6th Division were not funnelled into the battles of the Somme until September 1916, when they were committed to 3 phases in quick succession. During the Battle of Flers Courcelette on the 15th of September, the battalion were amongst the first assaulting waves and had the objective of capturing a fortified position called the Quadrilateral Redoubt. Newfangled monsters called tanks made their first appearance on the battlefield that day, but the 2 assigned to the brigade sector failed to arrive. The British barrage fell short and hit the Bedfordshire's assembly positions. German machine gunners in no man's land were untouched, and the redoubt was not visible to the artillery observers or the Royal Flying Corps, and in the event was completely untouched. Although B Company made progress clearing the trench on the flank, the frontal assault went badly. When the assaulting waves cleared the summit of the slope to the front of the redoubt, They came under such intense fire that the survivors went to ground in shell holes. The supporting waves fared just as badly, and once daylight faded, the brigade survivors returned to their starting trenches. During the attack, over 300 of the Bedfordshires were killed, wounded or missing, and by the month's end, the 4 battalions in the 16th Brigade had all lost at least 320 men, with the Bedfordshire's casualties reaching almost 390 officers and men. 10 days later, the battalion were in Brigade Reserve when the brigade successfully captured the German lines during the Battle of Morval, although the Bedfordshires still lost 52 men to shelling but were otherwise spared any direct action. The brigade were also involved in a largely unsuccessful attack during the Battle of Transloy in mid-October, and although the Bedfordshires took over the front line after the failed assault, they lost almost 70 men to shelling and sniping in the days that followed. The division spent several months out of direct action, and Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Oliver Villiers Russell, the Lord Ampthill, assumed command of the Bedfordshires from the 5th of April 1917 to the 19th of May 1917, when he was also promoted to GHQ, but this time under the Director of Labour. From the 15th to the 20th of April 1917, the battalion was heavily engaged in assaulting a complex, confusing and well-sited defensive network in what had been a mining town called Cité-Saint-Pierre, around Hill 70 in the Lens area. In conjunction with other divisions, the position was cleared almost entirely at close quarters by bombing along successive trenches, neutralising machine gun posts, and then holding firm against numerous counterattacks. During the fighting, and in spite of no typically costly frontal assault across open ground, the battalion lost 294 officers and men, being around a third of the entire brigade's losses for that month. The last 3 in their long list of commanding officers would join over the final 9 months of the battalion's existence. Between the 20th of May and 14th of June, Captain, Temporary Lieutenant Colonel, Herbert Rochfort McCulloch assumed command, after which he commanded a battalion of the Durham Light Infantry. Lieutenant Colonel James Robert Robertson took command from the 20th of July to the 6th of August 1917, after which he commanded a territorial battalion from the Leicestershire Regiment. And Lieutenant Colonel Reginald Lehoucquet would lead the battalion between the 15th of June and 10th of July 1917, and again from the 6th of August until the battalion were disbanded in February 1918. The 2 combined stints of 9 months, making him the battalion's second longest serving commanding officer whilst on the Western Front. The division remained in the Lens area throughout the 3rd Battle of Ypres that year, but were committed to the Battle of Cambrai from the 20th of November 1917, when they took all of their objectives, with the Bedfordshire's moving into divisional reserve on the 26th. On the 30th, German forces counterattacked, and the brigade was rushed in from support to retake the lost ground, with the Bedfordshire's arriving in the line later that morning. The Bedfordshire's were separated into companies and used in several places, helping to stabilise the position and securing river crossings over which the retiring British troops could safely escape, until the division was withdrawn once more on the 5th of December. On the 9th of December they were moved back into billets, the Bedfordshire's having lost around 110 men during the fighting. After a spell in reserve, news arrived that the battalion were being broken up, within a major reduction to the size and structure of the British Army. The men from the 8th Bedfordshire's were distributed amongst the other battalions in the regiment serving on the Western Front. After a farewell dinner for the officers on the 5th of February, drafts began leaving the battalion as it was wound down. The 7th of February saw 13 officers and 238 men leave for the 4th Bedfordshire's. The following day, 3 officers and 86 other ranks went to the 2nd Bedfordshire's, and 2 officers and 118 other ranks to the 6th Bedfordshire's. And on the 9th of February, 8 officers and 170 other ranks left for the 7th Bedfordshire's. The remaining men formed into details and were temporarily left under orders of 4 corps reinforcements. On the 11th of February, another 1 officer and 10 other ranks left for the 4th Bedfordshire's after they had taken part in a pre-arranged divisional sporting event. The final remaining batch of details were posted to the 5th Entrenching Battalion on the 16th of February 1918, forming No. 2 Company, along with the details from the 9th Suffolk and 8th Loyal North Lancashires. And the same day, the 8th Battalion of the Bedfordshire Regiment was administratively disbanded and ceased to exist. Despite their relatively short service on the Western Front, around 670 officers and men of the battalion were killed, with over half of that number being lost in the battles of 1916. Somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 were also wounded during the battalion's tours on the Western Front, depending on the source you read. Those who survived continued not only to keep in touch, but to make the effort to meet regularly, with the 8th Battalion's Old Comrades Association continuing to gather annually until at least the 1950s. So understandably proud were they, that they even had their own lapel badges made.